this part of the program. So we're going to talk now about sampling. And well, sampling is something very crucial in science in general, no? Because we are trying to talk about a given system, but rarely we have like all the resources and time to sample the whole system. So basically we have to choose and sample and look at different parts of that whole system uh, to be able to talk about this whole system based on these small parts. So the way we choose these small parts and how big are the parts we're going to measure, it's something very crucial, because depending on how we do that, we cannot really talk about a whole system if our sample is not adequate, is not good enough. And this is obviously also the case for LICCI. So we are talking here about local knowledge on climate change, and we want also to upscale that. We want to talk about local knowledge of indigenous communities across the world. As you've probably heard this morning, our dream of this project is to bring the voice of the indigenous people to policy arenas as well. So we want to talk about local and indigenous knowledge about climate change in a global scale, but obviously we cannot go out there and interview every indigenous person in the world, even every indigenous groups. So we have to define some criteria to go there and choose these indigenous populations, and also within each one of them to choose the villages where we're going to work, and to choose the people within this village who we are going to talk to. And this is what I'm going to talk to you now. So first step that we have already concluded is the site selection. So within the whole world, how we're going to choose the different indigenous populations, indigenous people and local communities who we're going to work with. Second part is within each one of these communities, how we are going to select the villages that we're going to work. I'm going to give you a bit of the definition of what we are understanding as village. We are aware that because societies out there are so different and so heterogeneous, these concepts are also quite flexible. And lastly, the how we select the interviewees within each one of those villages. So how can we do all these three steps in a way that is representative for what we want to talk about? So how can we ensure that the people who we talk with are representative of the villages where we are working, and this is all representative of the whole area where we work? And how can we ensure that all these different points in the map that we're going to work on a global scale are also representative of the what we call indigenous people and local communities across the world, especially in the context of climate change. So for the site selection, we have chosen to work in different sites across the world based on two main criteria. One of them is the climatic zone. So what you see here in this map is a climate classification. It's called Copenhagen climate classification. It's one of the most, let's say, used ways of classifying different climate types. It's based mostly on precipitation, seasonality, and also on temperature. And these different colors, they represent the different climate zones in the world. So because we wanted to talk about local perceptions on climate change and across the whole world, we also wanted to make sure that our sample of sites across the world are also representative of these different climate types. So we opened a big call about a year ago, recruiting people from all over the world, like you guys who work and have some experience with traditional communities or indigenous people. And so one of the main criteria for that selection of sites was where these people work. So how can we have all these different climate types represented, these climatic zones? And also another important criteria are the livelihood activities. So probably, as you have heard this morning, we also want to a fisherman or a hunter gatherer or an agriculturalist, they have different levels and different ways of interacting with the environment, and most likely will have also different understandings of environmental change and of climate change. So it's also important to take into account how these different people who practice different livelihood activities understand what is going on in terms of climate change. This it's important to call attention for the word predominant here, because we know that in many societies people do many different things at the same time, right? So it's rarely that you go into a community that are exclusively fishermen. They will always engage into other kind of activities as well, but usually we can kind of classify these different communities based on what is the main activity that they do that in their area. So keep that in mind and think about in your study site how you would define them in terms of the main livelihood activity. Sometimes it's very challenging. For my own field site, for example, in the Amazon where I work a lot, it's very difficult to classify that, because people really engage into very different things in quite similar levels. But just keep that in mind. Besides those two main criteria, we also considered other things in order to choose the areas where we were going to work. One of them is the data deficient areas. So there is areas in the world where there have been already studies about local knowledge on climate change. Also areas where there is quite a good coverage of weather stations. So also let's say the scientific information about climate, it's also very dense, while other areas in the world is like big blanks in the map, right? So we wanted also to focus as much as possible in areas where we had little information, both about climate and also about a few studies about local knowledge on climate change. We want also to have like diversity of ecosystems, in the sense of like work in areas that are more forested, in deserts, in grasslands, in areas that are also like polar zones. So we wanted also to ensure some representativeness of that. A wide geographical distribution, which is also related to previous points. So we wanted also to have like the big part of the globe covered. We want, as I said in the beginning, to talk about about this globally. So we also want to have our sites spread across the globe, and of course the studied population. So we also wanted to avoid to have like two of our partners working with the same indigenous group. So we also wanted to spread our sample across different studied populations, and obviously based on the existing arrangements and the expertise of the candidates that applied. So we to have this information, quality information, we also wanted to make sure that we were working with people that are know well the system who they're working with, and know well the people who they are working with. This is the result of our first call that we had selected after this first call, about 35 people. So in this map, you can see here like these different colors are the different climate zones, and the points are the people who we had selected. And then after this, we made we made a second call in order to cover some of the blanks in our maps, both in terms of the climate zones that we hadn't yet covered in the first call, but also in terms of the livelihood activities. So here in this table here in the bottom, you can see here like the agriculture, fishing, hunting, and pastoral. So these are kind of the main livelihood activities, and here the different climate types. So we made kind of this matrix to identify the holes in our sample that we had to cover in a second call for candidates. And this is what we did. So we had a second call to cover these blanks in the map, targeting livelihood activities and geographical locations that were poorly represented in our map. And this is the final, if not the almost final map of the partners we have been working across the world. As you see, people are working everywhere, so it's very exciting. We hear from people working in Mongolia in the same day as someone working in Chile or in Greenland. So it's been really, really nice to to have some contact with researchers and indigenous people that are looking into similar questions all over the world. And now the work that you are also going to do related to LICCI, it's also going to somehow become part of this big network, which is, I think, very exciting. So this was it for the site selection. So oh yeah, just to mention that now we have about 45 different sites across the world where we are working on. That includes also some sites of the core team. So as I said, I also have my own field site where I do my field work in the Amazon region in Brazil. And Petra also has a field site working in Spain, and so far and so forth. So the core team also works in these different areas, and we have also another 40 or so partners working in different zones across the world. The second important stage, once we have selected the sites, okay, within that site, how do we select the villages where we're going to work on, right? So, and what do we mean by village? The village is the lowest administrative unit in an area, normally under the jurisdiction of a village leader or council. So in some places, these are kind of circumscribed, so it's easy to identify, okay, this is a village here. You can see sometimes they even have like a circular shape or kind of an agglomeration of houses. In other places, they are much more scattered, like in space. So it's basically like a whole region where with a lot of scattered houses. So what is a village actually depends a lot on or how you define a village will depend a lot on the specific context of your field site. But usually they have something in common in terms of they have like a leader, or they have a kind of self-organization. There is something in terms of their organization and administration that allows you to call that thing like a kind of a unity that we're calling here a village. That name also, the terminology might also not apply to everywhere. And our aim for the sampling is to select between 3 and 5 villages within each study site. And how do we select those 3 to 5 villages within each study site? Well, these villages, they have to be relatively homogeneous, and homogeneous both in terms of environment, but also cultural conditions. So it's not like a good idea to choose within the same study site one village where people are belong to one ethnic group and the other villages belong to another ethnic group, because that introduces a lot of noise into the information that we want to look at, which is their understanding of climate change and climate change impacts. So, and that refers to like the cultural conditions. So ideally, well, not ideally, but they should not be culturally very different between themselves. And also in terms of environmental conditions. So, I mean, if your field site is characterized by some areas that are riverine, by rivers and other side, but other people live up in the mountains, you should think whether you should focus in just one of those environments instead of try to have villages spread all over these different environments, because this will also introduce a lot of complexity in the information that we're going to obtain. It can be that, for example, which also happens in my field site, for example, that some villages are located very close to the river, and so they are much more influenced by, let's say, the annual river fluctuation, and other villages are located farther apart from the river. And to me, it was very important to capture that diversity as well, because for me, it was impossible to talk about that given universe, that given population, focusing on just one of those two environments, because these two environments are super crucial and super part of the system. And so in my case, I had a similar number of villages in these two different environments. So I had like 4 villages close to the village, 3 villages close to the river, and another 3 far away from the river. So, but so this is, as you can notice already, this is something that it has also to be adjusted and suited to the specific conditions of each field site. But one very important thing to keep in mind is this: they shouldn't be so different in terms of environmental conditions. They shouldn't be so different in terms of cultural conditions. and they should also be representative of the study site. So let's say that you were working there with the Mapuche in Chile, and then you work in one or two villages that are like very close to the urban areas, for example, or which, I mean, indeed is part of that population. But remember that if you want to talk about the Mapuche, are those villages that are very close to the cities where people like work in jobs in the city. Is that really representative of the population who you want to talk about, who are the Mapuche? Probably not, right? So the criteria to choose the villages is that they should be representative of what, let's say, a typical village of that given population would be. So they shouldn't be so different. Other considerations for choosing the village is that the villages should have like a preferable size of 20 to 500 households. This minimum size of 20 is more for like convenience, because if you work in too many villages, as I'm going to talk to you like in a minute, you also have to invest more effort in doing more focus group discussions. I mean, for each added village that you add in your sample, that also means a lot of, not a lot, but quite a substantial amount of extra work. So to have like a minimum village size, it's actually good in terms to be able to use your time more effectively. And this maximum size is that then it becomes like very hard to to sample something that like so too large population. So for villages that are too big, which might be the case for some of you, consider breaking that into smaller units so it's more manageable in the way that you're going to sample and you're going to talk and choose people who you're going to talk to within that given village. So main messages here are these, like 3 to 5 villages within study site. They should be homogeneous in environmental and cultural conditions and representative of the study site, also in terms of their size and their location. The last part is actually the interviewee selection. So within each one of those villages, how you're going to choose the people who you're going to talk to. And this is very important, because if you want to talk about a given community, about their perception on climate change and climate change impacts, you should also make sure that the people who you talk to and their perceptions are representative of the perception of a collective perception of change. And so I think you've probably seen this also earlier. So I'm going to talk here more about this part here of the data collection, so which are basically like the semi-structured interviews and the focus group discussions. And so this last part of like how to choose the people who you're going to interview refers specifically to this part here of the whole framework of data collection for the LICCIs, right? We can come back to this later if you want. So we have two main research methods when we are going there to talk to people. One of them is the same structured interviews, and the other one are the focus group discussions. Each one of them, they have different goals, and they will also have different sampling strategies. The semi-structured interviews, the main idea of them, the main objective of those interviews is to get an in-depth understanding of the site regarding the local livelihood. So what do people do in this area? What do they work with? Is there some kind of division of labor? When do they do the different activities, and so far and so forth? So this is kind of a depth understanding, kind of a contextual information about the site where you're going to work with, where you're going to work. For those of you who already have like contact and experience in the field site, a lot of this information you already know, but it's important to have also some interviews with local experts to fill in gaps of information and to really have like a thorough understanding of the field site. In the tomorrow session, I think you will hear much more about the semi-structured interview, so this will become more clear. But this is just already to advance a little bit. But these are the main topics that will be addressed in the semi-structured interviews. Another important topic that we're talking to when we talk to people there are the timeline. So you will also talk to some local experts to understand what are the main, what are important events that are important temporal markers in time. And that is important because we're talking about change here. So it's important change related really in relation to what temporal dimension, what's the time depth that we're talking to. So building this timeline is something that is very useful to the next steps, which are actually the core of the LICCI part, which are the perceived changes, right? So in the semi-structured interviews is where we also get really in depth into the most important part of the LICCI, which are what are the changes that people perceive on the environment. Not only those related to climate, but we ask about changes in general. And after that, we ask about why are these changes happening, and then we start to understand how people understand the changes, but also their drivers. What are driving those changes? Some of those drivers are climatic, others are not. And also, what are people already doing to react to or to cope or to adapt to these different changes, right? So this is kind of the core part of our interviews. And after doing these semi-structured interviews, we do that with individuals. Then we bring that into a collective discussions, like which are what we're calling here the focus group discussions, where these, let's say, individual perceptions of changes, drivers, and adaptations are discussed collectively and validated in a group decision. As I mentioned before, we want to make sure that this information is representative of the whole population. So it's important also that the that this information here is agreed, is consensuated in a group activity, which are the focus groups. So for the semi-structured interviews, I'm going to start talking here first about this part here, the semi-structured interviews, how we're going to choose people to do or to reach these aims, right? Well, there are different strategies here depending on which of the topics. So as I mentioned before, the semi-structured interviews, we first are going to grasp an understanding of the local livelihoods, of this timeline, and also the calendar of different activities. And after that, we ask people about what are the changes that they perceive in the environments, their drivers, and their adaptations. And the sampling for each one of these sub-strategies within the semi-structured interviews are also different. So the first one, to get an understanding of the local livelihood, the timeline, and the local calendars, we do that through convenience sampling. So basically, we interview people that are available there to talk to us, right? And we aim here to get a relatively small number of interviews per site, but one very important thing here is that because it's like a thorough understanding of a contextual information about the field site, we want to make sure that we understand people that are most knowledgeable in the village, that are recognized by the other residents as people who know a lot about the place, because they're the ones who are going to provide you this general contextual information about what people do, when they do it, the different calendars, when have these important temporal markers happened in the past. So it's also important to interview people who have lived there in the village for a substantial amount of time, because then they can give you more precise information about these different events that happened in the past. And at least one very knowledgeable person per village, right? Because it's 3 to 5 villages that we want to aim at sampling. So we also want to have at least one very knowledgeable information interviewed per village, right? Of course, it can be more than these 3 to 5 interviews if you feel that you need further information to provide this general context of the area, and also to build the timeline or to build the local calendar of activities. You can also add more interviews here. I've done that in my field site. Several other partners have done that as well. So it's up to you whether you feel that all this information is enough, or if you need to talk to more people to gather to that general understanding, right? But the most important here part is that you're going to target specific people that are knowledgeable people and people who have been living in the area for a substantial amount of time. Again, all these the details of the content of this interview you're going to understand that better tomorrow. So tomorrow you will hear much more about what are the actual information that you want to obtain in these interviews. The second strategy is about the perceived changes, drivers, and adaptations. So after you have understood what are the different livelihoods that people do, when they do it, what were the important events that happened in the past, what are the changes then that people have noticed in their environment, why are these changes happening, and what are people doing in relation to those changes. So this second strategy, different from the first part, is based on quota sampling, right? And it's also based on a larger number of interviews per site. So we want to have here at least 15 to 20 interviews to obtain this information about changes, drivers, and adaptations. And this quota sampling here refers to the fact that we want to make sure that these people who we interview are representative of the different livelihoods that are practiced within each one of the study sites, but also representative, but also keeping a gender balanced and an age balance, right? So within your field site, you might have, even though your field site is predominantly, let's say, fishermen, there will be people in your field site who engage more into farming activities, or who, besides engaging in fishing, also do hunting, right? And these people might have different understandings, or will certainly have different levels of understanding of change in these different systems. So it's important within the study site, after you understood what are the different livelihood activities that people practice, which you have understood in the strategy one, to make sure that you interview people who are engaged into these different livelihood activities, right? Which is what you see here in the top of the table. Another thing that is very important is to keep a gender balance, right? So men and women have also different understandings of change based on their personal experiences, based on the different activities that they engage with. So it's important that besides having these different livelihood activities covered, you also cover interview more or less balanced, the same number of men and women. And another important thing here is also to interview people who are elders, so who have been there in the field site for a very long time, but also people who are younger, right? So they also have different understandings of change, and we also want to capture that diversity. So this is what we mean by quota sampling. So it is also it's important to keep these three elements in mind when you are choosing these 15 to 20 people who you were going to interview, right? So this is something that is super important. Most of the data on most of the information on what do people understand about change in the region will come from these 20 interviews. So it's very important that you choose these people wisely and based on these criteria, right? Okay, so this is just like a summary of the semi-structured interviews. So the objective, the aim, and here the sample size, right? And depend on aims, of course. So for the first aim, which is to have a general understanding of livelihoods, local time events, and calendars, we interview few people who are the real experts, the real knowledgeable people. And for the second part, which are the perceived changes, drivers, and adaptation, we interview 15 to 20 people, right? And the sampling strategy, it's also varies between these different aims. Convenience sampling for the contextual information and quota sampling for the perceived changes, drivers, and adaptations. So once that is done, we bring all that information to focus group discussions, right? So we're going to have like a big list of changes, of drivers, of adaptations based on what people have told you in individual interviews. So in order to make sure that this information is actually part of the collective understanding of this population who you're working with, we bring that to a focus group discussion that aims to discuss, validate, and identify the LICCIs, but also the LACCIs here, the adaptation strategies, through a group decision. Focus group discussions, probably you've all heard about it, but they're basically like collective discussions, right? Where there is a general guideline that we will follow, but it's important to also leave people to discuss between themselves, right? The idea here is really to validate, to understand what people, if they agree, if this is a given, if this given change is agreed upon within the whole group, or if it's just a very few people who understand this. So it's important to leave also people to talk during the focus group. You will also hear more about that in the tomorrow session. The number of focus groups is 2 to 4 focus groups per site, and they should be spread in the different villages, right? So at least like one focus group per village is recommended, but you might want to have more than one, because there are many different uh, power asymmetries, for example, within different villages. Sometimes when there are men and women within the same focus group discussion, women might feel ashamed of expressing their opinions. This happens a lot in my field site, for example. So sometimes we have chosen to make like the separate focus group for men and women, so that they feel a bit more at ease to talk about their perceptions of change, right? Also, another reason for having more than one focus group is because of internal conflicts, right? So it might be that some people simply do not talk to each other or have strong conflicts with each other, and we don't want to cause any problem there, right? So also it's important to always keep an eye and be attentive whether there are these conflicts there, and avoid putting together people who simply don't want to be together, right? So we don't want to disturb the, the local, right, the local community. So these are will also depend on each one of the field sites. In some field sites, this is not an issue. On other ones, it is. So you might have to do more than one focus group per village if those situations occur there. Another reason why you might want to do more than one focus group per village is due to village size, right? So if the villages are too big, you might just want to have more than one. And for the selection of focus group participants, we want to have like 4 to 12 participants per focus group. More than that, it becomes difficult to discuss that in group, and they can be selected through convenient sampling as well. Whoever is available and whoever wants to participate in the focus group can join. But also here we want to capture diversity of livelihood activities, expertise, age, and gender. We don't want to have a focus group only of the people who are really engaged in fishing, but also capturing the diversity of livelihood activities that you have already seen in the previous parts. So this is it, the kind of summary of the criteria for conducting the focus groups, right? And I'm not going to repeat this. So just the final remarks. Now, I mean, think about your field sites. Like, what are the villages that you would choose and why? Is there any difficulties in defining a village in your site and how you would define it? So keep that in mind, and we can discuss that also case by case with some of you. And does the criteria, how does the criteria presented here matches your local context, right? So how you would think of choosing these experts, or then conducting the other interviews, or what are the different livelihood activities that you think you might have to sample there, to include in your sample, and how many focus group discussions you would think would be relevant there. Of course, all these things will be decided lately after you're in the field as well, but like if you can already reflect on those things, it's important. And this is it. Thanks a lot for your attention. I think I've talked a bit too much.